Yeah, come. At least somebody. Yeah, so today is the fifth lecture. The fifth lecture of our session. And today is also a bit of a special lecture because Milica is also back and will also join us in this event tonight. And then we also have a double lecture. So we have Julio, who you know because we do the events together, and Markus Miessen. So it's a double input tonight. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of stuff coming tonight together that we have discussed in the previous ones. So I show you the overview again. So now we are in the middle, I believe. So we have discussed all the recent lectures. We have discussed like from top down, private, bottom up, and state projects. We have done almost all of them, and now we can kind of today discuss where we want to go and where we want to be. And I think for this double makes sense. And just to summarize a bit, the questions we can maybe take from the previous ones into what we are now discussing on participation and administration. So maybe the first lecture we had with Eva Čukić and Ella Esslinger was the Ministry of Space and the Ämter für Städtebau, and the Ministry of Space crucially created its own administration, like let's say off state, like off government, so a para institution, which I thought is a interesting question also in terms of democracy, which we will discuss today. Similarly, then with Eleni Achiotti, on the next lecture, we had this discussion on the neoliberal technocracy, so on something that went off bureaucracy into a technocracy that she criticized on the example of London, where we can now see like how should we go back to the bureaucracy, or what do we have, and maybe in Julio we will probably hear more about the today's bureaucracy. Then we had this with Claudia Ortomit from the Group for Express Projects, when you remember from the Ampere Hochbauten, where she presented this quite interesting group of architects designing in the administration, quite a unique example of something that exists in today's administration that is apparently not so technocratic as Eleni maybe said. So this is maybe an example we can discuss, but also Rebecca Wall and Felix Marlow last week just explained how public-civic partnerships play like a large-scale public civic projects in Berlin on a far bigger scale than we usually have discussed. How they work and how they fail, but also how this failure is actually productive and almost essential in their way. It's like, and I think this also links very nicely to today and to your input probably, this public-civic partnership. Yeah. So today we have then the question of democracy enter in administration as well. Today we start with Julio, who will who starts with an analysis based on his research on multiple institutions and cities in Europe. Julio Paulos is Associate Director for Research at the FCL in Zurich. Before Julio was a postdoctoral researcher in Lausanne and research assistant at the ETH here in Zurich. He did a PhD at the HU, which we learned last week, was at the institute from also Felix and Rebecca, where he analyzed modes of, let's say, modes of participation all around in 3 cities in Europe. He has researched and published a lot, actually, on the actor network theory and Bruno Latour. So in this, he's also an expert. And so we have Julio now giving an analytic, and then we will follow with Markus, who will give a more, let's say, design approach, and I will give a proper introduction after Julio. Yes, let me switch to you.
Okay.
Oh wait.
Okay. I don't know if I can I push this here.
Or move over, no?
Yeah, sure. Wasn't sure because of the light. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, welcome everyone. So today I'd like to take you into the world of performing the European city, and basically what I'll present today will be drawing from a body of ethnographic research that I've conducted within city administrations across Europe. So let me begin maybe with 2 short disclaimers. So as already was mentioned by Jakob, and probably unlike Markus' presentation, this isn't the result of a design studio or a collaboration or any hands-on project with a specific public sector partner. So I won't be presenting ready-made solutions or interventions. Instead, this is a social science research actually commissioned or funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation on planning cultures, and also partially financed by the German Research Foundation, the DFG. And a lot of what I showed today forms part of my PhD, which I wrote some years back, but also some part is conducted afterwards, and I'm working currently on the book manuscript. So you will see how the research stretches over several years, and it isn't limited to one tidy moment in time, and also not to one specific geographic place. So, and second, the second disclaimer is this is an ethnographic work, and we all know there's different styles of ethnographic research in the social sciences, and I rely mostly on the one of participant observation, but I also mix it with other styles of qualitative methods like remote approaches, digital ethnography, and also I work with a body of archival work. What was very important, and what I will show over the next 30 to 40 minutes, is also that this is an analytical perspective. So like Jakob mentioned, I will reflect and analyze how contemporary European urbanism is conducted and enacted across Europe. Maybe one thing which was very important for me to conduct my study was to build up a network of knowing local actors. And so you will see also how probably I navigated those contexts. So what I'm presenting traces how urban knowledge is produced and contested, how it's mobilized to support a new way of governing what's some call figuratively the European city. So it's a very generalized term, generic term. I don't want to overgeneralize because every context is different, but you will see what I mean. So, and as I guide you through this, please keep in mind planning, policy, design. I use them interchangeably sometimes, because they are not isolated silos, they are deeply entangled, and the entanglement is where the story of the European city begins. And let's start with an example from Lisbon. So here the mayor stands, the former mayor of Lisbon stands in front of a detailed city map. He addresses a large audience about a major urban project known as OIE. It's a very specific project, but it could be any other one. And behind him are keywords like affordable housing, public equipment, and mixed use, but also more technical terms. And he tells the public basically, we know how you feel, we know housing is scarce, and we want to build a city for you. And what makes this moment interesting could be the project, but it isn't necessarily the project itself, because it's a part of a longer series of development attempts on this piece of land. So it's more what stands out is the narrative that he uses. And he started using already in 2015. So the focus mainly is on citizens, the alignment of technical expertise, and public needs. So it's like we are a bit away from this top-down model of the master planner, but there's a kind of a shift in his narrative in how urban planning needs to be framed for the public good and is communicated increasingly during different public events. I could have used probably an example from the mayor of Paris, how she presents new urban infrastructure. So my point is Lisbon isn't alone. So another moment from my research was back in 2015, Vienna's vice mayor launched a new smart city framework. And unlike other smart city strategies, this wasn't about gadgets or sensors, but it was about making the city smart for people. So the emphasis again here was on lived experience, it was on inclusions, and it all conveyed a value-driven agenda. Vienna wanted to stand out, not just by adopting what was back then quite new, smart technologies, but by rethinking what being a smart city would be for people. So, and then another more familiar example maybe, and here we are in Zurich in 2018, if I'm not wrong. This was during the rollout of the 2030 city vision, Zurich 2030 or 35. I can't really remember, but there was a strong emphasis in this talk on balancing growth and densification with maintaining quality of life. I think this picture is quite nice because it shows the expert round table and then the audience. I mean, also in the audience, it's not just publics. You see some familiar faces, some politicians, some actors, some experts. And what I want to show with these three vignettes, with these three ethnographic snippets, is that these examples show us that across Europe, and at least for the last 15 to 20 years, politicians and urban experts are increasingly engaged in engaging the public, outwardly, openly, and in ways that are highly performative. These aren't just consultations. It's not about the master plan being open for consultation, but these are very well rehearsed, choreographed efforts to connect with citizens and to show responsiveness, to show attentiveness. So what does this tell us about the evolving model or identity of European, and in this precise case, Western European, maybe also Southern, if you take it? It tells us something, but before I come there, I want to draw on some literature. So you have a lot of research on European cities and on the European city model. Urban sociologists like Patrick Legales or Yuri Kazapov have long analyzed European cities as incomplete, they call it incomplete reflections of society. And they say they analyze it within the kind of new forces, like globalization, neoliberalization, or entrepreneurialization. And they explain how these external forces basically shape European urban society. but often, very often, so their focus remains on this kind of external conditions, and there's little attention paid to the public or the local public sector and its more administrative dynamics. They are more treated, in this case, as a backdrop. But if we zoom into these practices, if we trace also maybe their controversial aspects, if we follow the actors, follow the actors like Bruno Latour says, and examine who's producing urban change, for whom and how, we see a different story than what those urban sociologists tell us. And this is also the moment where maybe we can introduce some other body or stream of literature which focuses more on the urban politics. And a good example, or one of the very latest examples, is the work by Ross Beveridge and Philip Koch, who some might know. And they describe urban politics as a struggle over meaning and authority in cities. So who gets to decide what the city is, what it should do, and for whom? This is what is at stake in urban politics. And I think this is a very helpful way to look at debates around things like housing, like transport, or climate action. But here's the catch, at least how I see it. Because this way of thinking often starts with the idea that cities are where democracy can be revitalized, in contrast to more national contexts. And actually what fascinates me more, and what I want to make the object of today's presentation, is the opposite idea, how democracy itself, especially new ideas about transparency and participation, have reshaped the way we even think about cities. So it's not just about local councils or debates in city halls, it's about how political strategies are built into the fabric of the city, into the policies of the city, into buildings, into apps, into mobility plans, or even rankings. So rather than seeing politics as something that happens in the city as an arena, we can start seeing the city itself as a product of political approaches and strategies. So I work with this kind of research question today. To understand how European cities work, we need to explore grounded and situated practices, something what Lucy Suchmans calls configurations, and so I draw on Lucy Suchman's work, which allows us to understand cities not just as sites where politics happen, but as configurations that are continuously enacted through different interactions. And this can be between people, technologies, and spaces. This kind of thinking is, as Jakob also mentioned before, very common in actor network theory. I won't go into detail here because I think it's too theoretical and might not be important. But bottom line, what is important if we take this approach is to understand how cities are not just governed by people, but they are made and known through different processes of public display, evaluation, and performance. So the first figure, or this first configuration I want to focus on is the laboratory. And when I say laboratory, I don't mean the one with the microscopes or the white coats, the kind of science laboratory. I mean more like this kind of urban labs that are emerging everywhere, living labs, real-world labs, or design studios that play a growing role in reshaping how urban expertise is organized. This is actually here in Zurich. It's the project Neugasse was an SBB-led urban transformation project, which is another story I won't tell here because it was rejected by a public referendum. But actually, I think this picture could be shown or could be taken in many places around Europe. And we see how here, in this specific case, labs bring together different stakeholders, different people, politicians, experts, citizens, stakeholders in general, and they are structured environments for collaboration and experimentation. So a bit like architecture studios, if you are studying architecture or working in architecture, you can see how this kind of labs, they rely on posters, they rely on visual materials, and on models. They blend the experimental ethos of the lab, the more scientific experimental ethos of the lab, with also solution-oriented mindset of design. So in this kind of space, you can create not just to design the city, but perform new ways of co-producing knowledge. And these labs aren't just about process, they are about practice. So there's a French sociologist, Brice Laurent, who explains that here in this case, urban experimentation involves hands-on techniques, post-it notes, working groups, workshops. The physical process of making ideas visible is the most central in this process. And what's also notable is how big issues like, let's say, climate change, housing, they are broken down and translated into small objects, materials. They are part of the concrete proposals that these working groups produce. And yet, I'm not saying these are bad or good things. What I'm saying is like that even when these labs generate interesting ideas or prototypes, these must still enter the machinery of governance afterwards. So there are still councils, there are departments, there are a sequence of regulatory bodies that come afterwards. So yes, labs are sites of collaboration, yet there's a lot of negotiation and constraint still happening afterwards. And without overgeneralizing, I'm just saying that this emerging configuration is quite visible, but needs to be put in perspective as in each situation. For example, the one by SBB here, which I draw a lot of material on and could go more into detail, was highly contested publicly as participation washing, while SBB, I think they played according to the book. So you have different camps who claim that accountability is not right, and the case could be discussed in many ways. But for me, it was more about showing the kind of lab practice here. So the second figure I want to talk about is the forum. So originally, urban forums were small, and they were often stakeholder-led spaces for discussion. So in the 1990s, and here's the Stadtforum of Zürich West, as cities shifted from bureaucracy to management, forums became more prominent. Today, they are highly organized platforms used to share updates, host workshops, and invite citizen input. This was one of the forums that was organized in Vienna during the Smart City Vienna framework strategy. So if we talk about the forum, we are not making a reference to the Greek agora, the public place, or I don't know, some like Jürgen Habermas, the philosopher, he uses the public sphere as the moment of shared communication. This is more closer to what sociologist Michel Calon calls hybrid forums. So it's new forms of exchanging, of sharing knowledge and participation, and bring people together. And the spread of these forums and their claims to knowledge have changed how urban governance works across many European cities or cities in the global north. For instance, here's an example from Lisbon, where they have the regeneration, the rehabilitation fair during the Urban Development Stakeholder Week. And it's interesting to see how it brings together developers, how it's highly curated, how public officials come, and how also this is open to the public. So forums now they make key announcements. They are hosting discussions. Forums help target different publics, and they are part of a knowledge economy that is increasingly visible in how cities are administered. And they serve multiple goals, I think, obviously participation, but also transparency and legitimacy. And they are also highly attractive for other stakeholders like developers, investors, and they help city administrations navigate the tension between openness and control. The third configuration that became highly visible is how local administrations increasingly need also to display their work, not just as policy briefs, but how they visualize policy into different forms of outlets. So in Vienna, this was when the strategic master plan was discussed and prepared. They organized an exhibition, and the mayor back then told me in an interview that exhibitions empower citizens and they build a shared knowledge base. And actually, I think there are two types of exhibitions worth noting. First, there's this mission-based exhibitions, like when there's a new master or a new strategic plan coming, or a smart city framework strategy. So they are designed to communicate complex plans in accessible ways. But there's and as you can see, this exhibition, I think especially the Stadt Smart Entwickeln, circulated. It was then in Munich. It was also, I think, in Barcelona afterwards. So what initially was something to convey a certain meaning or facilitate meaning in the public becomes a best casing practice that circulates in other cities. But exhibitions also plug into this kind of, what I just mentioned, international circuits. So they allow cities like here, I think this was Lisbon, that was showing this booth or having this booth at the Barcelona Municipal Week, where all cities come together for different initiatives. So, like, there's the one thing to facilitate and translate local initiatives to publics, but there's also the kind of best casing practice that emerges from this knowledge accessibility. So similarly, the growing exchange also highlights that the increasing demand for transparency and accountability in how cities operate and communicate innovations are connected to sharing knowledge across the municipality. But these exhibitions, they don't just travel internationally, so or in given forums. They also circulate locally in different contexts. So in Lisbon, for instance, the call for proposals for square redesign was printed directly onto these kind of posters in the public place itself. It showed the competition, the entries, the rankings, and the winning design, turning the city itself into an open-air sort of museum of planning and change. So all the competition entries were publicly displayed on site, including all the information that I just listed. And this also basically shows how local administrations also turn their own spaces into venues for showcasing municipal initiatives, agendas, and policies, bringing planning out of the office, out of the hidden backdrop of the office, and into the public eye. The final configuration, which I want to talk about, is the recursive celebration of urban change. So across European cities, you have a lot of ceremonial moments that serve not only to present changes, but also to justify them politically. Here we are in Lisbon, and just to tell you that in a way, inaugurations are more than just symbolic gestures. They are ways to show that urban transformation reflects contemporary values, that it reflects aspirations. And in this particular case, I think the one on the left, you see how the mayor inaugurated a public place. It shows the face of a very known fado singer, historical public figure, Amalia Rodriguez, and it was presented by a national actor. And this was done by a street artist, and the municipal workers were there. So it's all highly curated. Or on the other side, you can see the inauguration of a green public space, or when Lisbon became the green capital of Europe in 2020. And this maybe is the most extreme way to show how the European cities performed, is that city governance in itself has become also a kind of performance, because these inaugurations they also function as rites of passage. They mark and validate the evolution of urban spaces. And of course, this isn't very entirely new, because for instance, the construction sector has long been using this kind of technique, like the Spatenstich. When you inaugurate a new building, you have this ceremony around it, and when a major project is completed, you showcase it with this kind of act. And here you can see the vice mayor, Maria Vasilaku, the former vice mayor of Vienna, who was also in charge of urban infrastructure. And this was one of her biggest achievements when she turned or redesigned the Maria-Hilfer-Straße, which is one of the biggest and was a very car-centric city, into a pedestrian street, which also was highly acclaimed across Europe. Other political leaders, which I had the chance to interview when I was in Vienna, like here, the former mayor, they have used architectural models to present, in this case was a new mobility strategy. So you turn abstract plans into something tangible, into a common vision that you communicate. And also here, again, in Lisbon, various planning tools and visualizations that have been used to celebrate the redesign of the downtown public spaces, which aimed at changing parking lots into places for recreation, for shared mobility, and for sanitation, as you can see on the bottom left, where the whole riverfront was sanitized. So to conclude, what I just tried to show is that the European city is this new reconfiguration of European urban politics is often shown as one way, or a new model of communication, of performance, and yet these are very complex situations. Of course, there's similar patterns of urban engagement across those cities, and yet they are composed of very complex dependencies, of very complex political fields. And of course, making cities more accessible, livable, and responsive requires more than just good ideas or political strategies. But we can see how increasingly we have new platforms, new interfaces, new reconfigurations of where planning knowledge, urban knowledge gets translated and generated into new meanings. And I just wanted to show that these mechanisms create also new ways of valuing the city through policies, but also through awards, through exhibitions, and they lead obviously to new ways of indexing the city. And obviously I didn't elaborate on everything, but it was more an idea of sketching this kind of new ways of knowing the city. In what I've just presented, I wanted to show particularly these kind of four figures: the laboratory, the forum, the exhibition, and the ceremony, and how they co-constitute a new way of practicing the European city. Thanks. That's all for me, and I look forward to your questions, comments, and the discussion afterwards.
Okay, nice to see you all. Thanks for the invitation. So what I'm going to do tonight is, usually when I give my, let's say, regular talks, I tend to mix the work that I do at my studio, which is it's a design studio, and the work that I do as part of the chair of the city of Esch in Luxembourg. Tonight what I'm focusing on is purely the work that we do in Luxembourg, and most specifically this one specific project which is called the Esch Clinics. But what I will do in the beginning is I go a little bit back to just give you a bit of a kind of context in terms of where I'm coming from, and especially where I've come from in terms of participation, because I think this is something where there will be a lot of overlap, but there will also be some differences, I think, so this will be very interesting. These 4 books basically together form my PhD that I wrote many years ago. And they were basically, let's say, critically interrogating different forms of spatial practice when it comes to the topic of participation. And I was rather critical at that time, which was at the kind of early 00s, because there were a lot of tendencies, especially in the UK, where I was studying at the time, where especially under New Labour, participation was kind of used as a tool, I would say, to formulate particular strategies, but at the same time not really kind of deliver, I would say. And I'm not going to go too much into these books now, but try to get straight to the core so that we can actually continue with the work on the Esch Clinics. So for me, the main question was really when people, especially in politics and public administration, talk about participation, what do they really mean? So is it that kind of participation that most of us probably think of when we think of the 60s, 70s, and early 80s? Is it something that connects to any kind of historic trajectory, or is it maybe something else? And my kind of hunch, let's say, was that, especially in the context of the UK, that it was rather a kind of misuse of the term, particularly in terms of misusing it as a tool for political legitimization, so that you could actually say that you've opened up the, there's several, let's say, ways in which we can call it. You introduced some of them, I think, that are, let's say, relatively regularly used by the political class, I would say. But I was, and I'm now breaking this brutally down because we only have half an hour. So, but for me, then the question was, okay, maybe if we want to talk about this today, and especially from the point of view of an architect or a kind of spatial practitioner, would it also be possible to think about it in a different way? So rather than kind of opening up the table and inviting everyone to the table to say that I or you as an individual or collective practitioner have to actually assume some kind of responsibility, that you are actually forcing yourself into a kind of context in which you don't actually understand the participation, so to speak, of others, but your own critical participation in this context. And for me, this was very important because at that time, I thought that there was a kind of, let's say, highly romanticized idea of participation. And I looked specifically into questions of, practicing without mandate and what this could mean in terms of self-initiated critical spatial practices. So in other words, let's say interrogating consensual practices and also understanding the value of dissensus as a productive mode of conflict. And there were, let's say, three working questions. So one was the question of responsibility and how we assume it, question of authorship and what it means in terms of collaborative practices, and the question of agency, especially because at that time there was this kind of always this, the elephant in the room, so to speak, was like when people would talk about participation, it was always like this kind of like, you're doing some kind of social work. And I really wanted to make a kind of distinction between these two things, because I don't think that as architects or planners we're social workers, but I think a lot of the stuff that's out there also in terms of the kind of collaboration with social services are, of course, extremely relevant. So for me, I then used a German word, which probably those of you who speak German, of course, know, Einmischung, but which unfortunately translates terribly badly into English. So it sits somewhere between these three terms, so proactive practice, getting involved, and practicing as a productive irritant. And this was then something that in the last book of this quadrilogy, which is called Cross-Benching, I tried to use an analogy to the British House of Lords to kind of play a joke on this political system, which then connected to this question of, how can you actually assume this responsibility without being part of the kind of system, quote unquote. And one thing that I'm working a lot with in terms of both my own work in the design studio, but also in my work as I try to not use the word academic, but I guess I should probably finally live up to the fact that I'm also an academic. But it sits somewhere between this question of like staging discourse and enabling conflict, but in a purely spatial way. So I hope we get to this at some point. So I want to start with this fantastic quote by Alison Arieff, "What's wrong with politics? Let's start with the benches." And this is basically what this little book tried to look at. So it was to look precisely at the House of Lords, which is a kind of abstract drawing of that space, which you see here. And one particular section of the House of Lords, which is this central one. These guys, I have to say guys, because they're mostly are guys, apart from one lady. And they're called the cross benches. And they're very interesting. You started with a disclaimer, so I should also start with one. I'm not interested in this as a political space. This is like extremely conservative. It has all its problems. We don't need to go into this now. But I'm using this as an analogy for this particular section for two reasons. So one is that I think it's super interesting how they are organized within the space so that they sit literally between the benches. So they sit essentially between two political camps. And they're the only ones who don't belong to a political camp, but they only represent themselves. in there, which of course is very different to this space, which is the House of Commons, which is also very interesting and something that I often refer to when I talk about proximity, because I really enjoy the fact that it's such a highly curated space and it's very, let's say, object-based. There's this idea both of the, confrontation of two political sides, of two political camps, but also this extremely, let's say, curated object that has all these kind of, then on top of it, you have the scale of a piece of furniture, which is of course also surrounded by kind of collective furniture. And then you have all these objects that play particular roles and that are also very much choreographed. And I'm very much interested in what happens when you actually bring people together in space. I mean, this sounds like a really bad one-liner, but I think in this space you actually understand what this means. Because if you compare it with any other parliamentary space in the world, there's a huge difference, which is basically that in most spaces you have a kind of frontal setup where one person talks to an audience, whereas here, basically the two camps are confronting each other and you basically stand up and look down onto your kind of opponent, quote unquote. So we're now changing geography and we're moving to Kuwait. So in 2010 and 2011, I was working as part of a fellowship at the GSD on a project together with Joseph Klima, where we looked at these political spaces called Diwania, which are very interesting from our point of view because they're not only decentralized urban typology, but they're really understanding everyday space as a kind of, you could use the word forum or other words, for pluralist governance, but in an extremely informal and what we thought of as very productive way. So you see here a couple of images of these spaces. They probably wouldn't strike one as particularly, probably neither democratic nor particularly collective, because you also realize that it's only men, and some of them are smoking, and some of them are looking that they're connected to some kind of medical device, but actually it's a PlayStation. But there's all this kind of, let's say, informal setting. You move to another space, which is exactly the same space of 4,000 spaces in the city of Kuwait, which are have exactly the same function, and which are all part of the spatial typology of Diwania. But they move extremely across, let's say, the ladder of economic possibilities. So you have here a Diwania of an extremely affluent family and the outside of that space, but you have here Diwania in one of the refugee camps on the city's periphery. You have here a fisherman Diwania, you have a very informal Diwania at the street corner, and so on. So basically what we were looking at was the kind of function of this particular structure in the whole kind of setup of Kuwaiti society. And the way that you have to understand this is that it's a historic typology where it goes back all the way to the period when Kuwait was a nomadic culture, and basically where crossroads would, or where there would be kind of crossroads on nomadic paths, tents would be set up, and one tent, which was called the Diwania, was the tent where you would basically exchange information. And the way in which this was then taken through Kuwaiti urbanization is extremely interesting, because this decentralized structure, which exists 4,000 times, it's basically connected to private homes. Mostly, there's also some other ones, but most of them are connected to private homes. So it's the opposite of the female space. In the house is the courtyard, and then you have the Diwania, which is plonked. It's basically a box that you plonk onto the house from the outside, and that historically was male only. Now this has changed. But the interesting thing is that it's really a space for localized discussion, and then there's a system of how the information from these kind of decentralized structures is being trickled up the political ladder all the way to the democratically elected parliament. Again, here disclaimer, so as the House of Lords has its issues, obviously also this system has its issues, because when we talk about Kuwait, although there's a democratically elected parliament, there's also an emir. But I'm not trying to make any kind of use this as a kind of democratic model, but I'm just describing that I think this, again, proximity to the citizen is extremely interesting. So we produced a couple of, let's say, products that came out of this. One was a 2-channel video that was also shown in several locations and instances. And also many years after now, fast forward 10, 15 years, there's a book that came out recently called Agonistic Assemblies that also connects to the subject that basically took the Diwania project as a starting point to develop this notion of proximities, which we also recently discussed when we went back to the GSD in a forum that connected to these questions of spaces for everyday democracy. So finally, I'm coming to the hopefully interesting part that connects to what you're doing and what we're doing at Cultures of Assembly, which is the name of my chair at the University of Luxembourg. And those of you who haven't been to Luxembourg, which I'm guessing are almost all of you. So who's been? Okay, you don't count because you're from Luxembourg. So 2, 3, 4. Okay, wow, okay, that's actually 5. Okay, that's impressive, given that we're only 15, so I've never had this. So you have to imagine that the University of Luxembourg is kind of an interesting institution because it's very young. And given that the country is so small, you would think that it's in the capital city, but it's not. So they've actually made a political decision in the late 90s to shift it towards the south region. And when I say the south region, we're talking like 15 minutes by car to the south, and that's then where the country ends. So it's very small. But nevertheless, it's a completely different geography, both in terms of the literal kind of urban geography, also the topographic reality, but also the social geography. And the main reason for this is that Esch, which is this city that you see here, which has approximately 40,000 inhabitants, used to be the very heart of the European steel production. And up until the 80s was basically a really kind of not only working class geography, but really let's say, unhealthy place to be in. So we're talking right at the French border. We're talking at that time 4 major steel plants surrounding a tiny city. And since the 80s, I mean already before, but really since the 80s, the whole region, or this south region, which is called the Minette, has been going through a kind of massive transformation. And so what you see now are all these kind of relics, you could say, of that particular period of the mostly 20th century. And there have been some attempts, let's say, to problematize this, but from my point of view, in a very unsuccessful and also slightly embarrassing way, which was partially through a European Capital of Culture project in 22, which was called Esch 22. Which was basically kind of fireworks of how to destroy 65 million euro. And but there were some, let's say, projects, very rare projects, that actually tried to do something that would create a kind of, let's say, a trajectory that would go into the next, let's say, maybe 10, 15, 20 years. Everything else basically evaporated. So when I applied to this job in 2020, I proposed that since, if you look back at this image, it's a kind of very strange situation, because you have the city, I mean the city continues here, but you have the city of Esch here, and then you have this massive site here, which is a steel plant, which is actually the last remaining active steel plant in the region. And then behind here, what you see here with this red building and these 2 structures and all this kind of development, that's the new campus. And the campus was basically built onto an existing steel site campus, where 50% of the steel plant was basically removed by 3,000 Chinese laborers, brought to China and rebuilt. But what you understand is that there was this political decision to move this campus and the university to this geography, at this end promising the people in the south, mostly the people in Esch, that this would be their way of delivering some kind of transformation from heavy industry to service and knowledge, and then at the same time plonking it on the other side of the steel plant so that there would be no connection whatsoever between the city and the campus. So when I applied for the job, I said that I would be very interested in it, but not to work from the campus, but from the city, and proposed that I would basically build up a space in the city from where we would operate. And then everyone was like super interested and applauding the idea. And then I got the job, and then I arrived in Esch, and I said, okay, so let's do it. And then everyone was like, okay, but this is not possible. Like, how are you going to do this? We can't do something outside the campus. It's not possible for so many reasons. So we were fighting for this for about 2 years. Finally, with the help of the mayor of the city, then managed to find a space in this street, which is one of the pedestrian streets in the heart of the city, which is very interesting. You can also probably say a lot about this since you know the Luxembourgish situation. So in Esch, there's a huge Portuguese population of more than 40%. There's a huge Italian population. There's a huge North African population. So the, let's say and I say this quote-unquote bio-Luxembourgers, they're in the real minority, which is very interesting. And you have basically, depending on which street you're in, you're sometimes facing a completely different demographic, you're facing a completely different language that's being spoken. So I would say in that part of the city center, there's at least 5 languages that are being spoken, and they're being spoken exclusively. So it's really like, you go into the next street, you feel like you're in, I don't know, in Lisbon, you go into one other street, you feel like you're in Torino. And so we found a space in one of these blocks, which we then, now I'm really going to run through this so to actually get to the project. So we spent some time to turn this into a space that we could use, and with the idea in mind that this would be both a kind of office for our kind of on-site work with the city. We can later talk about what this means, because we're not, that's maybe important to say. Although it's called Chair of the City of Esch, which was an idea that they had many years ago at the university, we're obviously not service providers, and we're also not working on, let's say, fixed collaborations with the city. Nevertheless, what I'm doing is that I'm really focusing on this geography with at least my research projects. And this is also why this was very important for us to have this space right there. And so when we actually opened the space in early 23, we decided that we were going to do 2 things, so that we would use it as a general site of all our explorations together with the citizen of Esch, but also as the home of our research project, which we started this year, last year, that's called the Esch Clinics. And if you go to our website, culturesofassembly.org, you will see that there's basically, at the moment, it's kind of an interim site, but there's a kind of twofold strategy. So there's, on the one hand, a podcast channel that introduces many of the kind of topics that we're interested in, discussing it with international contributors. And then there's also a PDF archive of all the different activities that we run in the space. And all those things are purely, let's say, research-based. So when I say research-based, this means that usually in those projects, students are not, let's say, directly participating. Of course, they're participating in the events, but they're not part of the research project. Whereas there's a whole other kind of line of work, of course, that has to do with working on research projects also with the students that have, compared to many of the other, let's say, teaching that's going on at the university, a very kind of embedded spirit. So usually what we do is we work on specific projects in the region, and we try to also not only work with stakeholders and communities, but also involve them in the whole kind of kind of development phase of the project, so they're really involved at any stage. But I think the difference, maybe we can discuss this later, is that it's not a kind of charrette or some kind of situation where we're necessarily like always asking them for their opinion and try to then include their opinion, but where we rather, let's say, go out with provocations and then start a kind of dialogue around particular issues. What's interesting there, I would say, is that, and again, we can talk about this later, but I would say that some of the kind of typologies that you explained, we have them also in Luxembourg, but when I look, for example, at those typologies in Luxembourg, what's happening is that you usually end up with the usual suspects. So there are, of course, in any bigger development project also participatory formats, but you go to 3 of them and you realize that regardless of which city they're in, it's actually always the same people. And usually those people, you can guess, they're well educated, they usually come from a particular kind of background in terms of the kind of content background that they have. They're also usually from a relatively wealthy background, so that they can actually afford to be there, so they can afford to make that time. They can probably afford to have someone looking after their children or after anything else that needs to be done during this time. So last year we started this project that's called the Esch Clinics, and this project for us, it's kind of a starting point for a quite serious engagement with this Minette region, and specifically Esch. And basically what we wanted to test or try was to develop a format of work where we basically work with a large group of international collaborators and also local and regional collaborators, but people who we basically sent out into the city to work with particular groups. And that's also this, we can discuss it later, but I think that's maybe where it differs from these kind of normative models, that we're not waiting for people to come to our table, but we use the table only as a model or object to, let's say, formulate questions together or problematics, and then go out. And we do this with collaborators. So to give you a very quick description of how you have to imagine this entire project over the space of the 4 years. So we have essentially a phase which has now slightly changed, but it will run more or less until here, which is a phase where we basically program very heavily with approximately 65 contributors. So those are individuals and collectives who basically come to Esch as where we have a collaboration with a residency, where we have 2 apartments where those people who come, they can stay. And they then work specifically with particular questions, but also, as I said, particular communities, particular groups of citizens that cluster around particular subjects and so on. With the idea in mind that we produce at this kind of results moment, which is at the end of 26, a pre-digestion phase that works towards policy. And the end of this project is actually in 27, a set of policy recommendations that will be handed over on the local, regional, and national levels. But what's really important is that all these projects always have, let's say, although they have sometimes quite theoretical starting points, they have actual, let's say, projects that are connected to the city and that are placed in the city. And they, as you can see on this timeline on the bottom, sometimes also vary in terms of length. So these are some of the contributors of the project. But what's very important to understand is that we take some of these projects out to really work with the city on, let's say, long-term goals. So these are not subjects or questions that the city came up to introduce to us, but where we went, for example, to the city and said, okay, it could be actually quite interesting to rethink this this subject of assemblies, where, you know, when we usually think about citizen assemblies, it's a deliberative process. But what happens if you actually start to think about how this could work also in an agonistic way? So that, of course, if you want to set up a citizen assembly, there are certain, let's say, rules, there are certain kind of normative ideas of how this can be done. But maybe there could be ways to do this slightly differently. And this is, for example, one of the long-term projects that we're running as part of the Esch Clinics, or that we have already been running for a long time, that started already 2 years ago with an NGO and non-profit called DemocracyNext, with whom we've basically been working ever since, and in a very slow and long process, convinced the city, which in this case didn't mean just to convince the mayor, but also the what's called the Chefenrat, so the basically the local parliament, and all the parties to work on this project with us. And that's now where it becomes specific and different from other international projects like this, where actually with the end result that at the beginning of next year, the citizen assembly is being written in the constitution of the city as a permanent arrangement. Because usually what you have is, as part of these kind of typical projects, you have, for example, a big development project, and maybe if they're really radical, quote unquote, they do a citizen assembly maybe on one topic. But I would say that most of these projects are kind of like hot air or placebo, because they're being used again as a form to, well, basically to tick boxes and to say, okay, the general public has been involved, but it's not a kind of, let's say, long-term or holistic involvement. And so basically, the way that we've been setting this up now was to really design the infrastructure and logistics of this project in the administration of the city. So how can this be done and implemented, and how can you also get the people of the city involved in this? So, for example, what we've been doing with DemocracyNext is now for almost 1 year doing basically weekly workshops with different people from the public services of the city, where they basically join. I mean, these are all online, because we're part of this is part of an international project where there's also the city of Vilnius and also one American city involved, where we are basically then meeting with all these people from the administration of these 3 cities, and then DemocracyNext basically has the lead on all the different workshops for the different services of the city surrounding this question of citizen assemblies. And then there's, of course, many other people involved in this in terms of also how the sortition works, and you know, how do you invite 40,000 people from a city to a project like this? How do you make sure, for example, that also the homeless population is being invited? There's a lot of very detailed questions that I don't have the time to go into. But for us, what was also very interesting was this this process that I, for example, had never done before. How, on the one hand, you kind of satisfy the kind of formal needs. So how do you make sure that this actually lands within the city administration? But then how do you do all the backup work? So what you see, this kind of dichotomy in this image, that you have this kind of representative moment, but then the actual work, which is always happening in the back rooms. So, for example, here in the back room, you have all the heads of the political parties. So we had to have, for example, all these meetings with, you know, individually with the heads of the political parties, with the political parties as a whole, with the coalition, with the opposition, with different people to make sure to get them on board and so on, which of course was something that before we were really not used to do. At the same time, by this point, we've also are using the space as a kind of venue for small and very, let's say, targeted short-term exhibitions that are addressing very specific problematics within the Luxembourgish context. This one, which happened recently, was looking at the topic of migration, and particularly migration camps and landing camps in Luxembourg, most specifically in Luxembourg City in this case, but also then trying to problematize it to the extent that we use this as a starting point to start a kind of, let's say, public discourse around a particular topic. And this is also very important to understand when I go back to this here, that, for example, this last phase, which then finally ends with, the toolbox and the handover of the policy recommendations. There's actually a phase before, which is very important, which is public campaign or political campaign, you could say. And this was the development that is fairly recent. So this we changed this about a year ago. Originally, there was the idea to have an internationally traveling exhibition that would basically summarize the outcomes of this project. But we then realized that you also then have this problem of the, this particular bubble that we're in, which will probably be the audience, and a kind of, let's say, repetition of discourse within our own kind of remit. So we decided to basically drop the exhibition and use the entire exhibition budget for this public campaign. And the idea for the campaign is that it basically runs 6 months before the handover of the policy recommendations, so that there's already public discourse that takes place around this subject, so that it's less easy for the politicians to drop it like a hot potato. Because this was something that you probably remember from Luxembourg in transition. It was a very interesting project. There were also very interesting outcomes, and then it took 10 seconds after there was a change in government to drop it, or mostly drop it, let's say. And this is something that we really want to avoid. And so at the moment we're already, for example, in a phase where we have for example, a column in the national newspaper where we also communicate what we're doing at all the different stages. But we're also trying to work quite specifically with particular, let's say, decision makers, quote unquote, or groups or practices or experts, in this case, for example, the police, to see how you can think differently about their kind of normative practices. So one thing that we noticed in Esch that's quite severe in terms of the streetscape and the way in which people kind of move in public space is that the police had quite a, let's say, aggressive presence. So they were driving in the pedestrian areas with cars, with like fully geared up police, men mostly, sometimes women, that looked like kind of riot police. And so one thing that we started a kind of discourse around was this kind of reintroduction of what is called proximity police. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept. So it's basically how, for example, I grew up, for example, in a very small village in Germany many years ago. And so there was one policeman in the whole village, and this guy was not even wearing a hat, and you would know him by his first name, and he wasn't wearing a gun. And so this person was actually very much part of the community and would also know what's going on, would know of the problems, would actually be in kind of constant exchange with the citizen. And so we proposed this, and now, for example, as a result, there's this kind of process now. It's very small at the moment, so with only 24 policemen as a kind of test case, but they're trying this out at the moment. And I just wanted to also show you at the end a couple of images from one specific project that's spatially quite interesting that we're working on at the moment with the artist Franziska Eigner. So you have to imagine this whole south of Luxembourg, it's kind of like a Swiss cheese. So it was also mining territory. So you have hundreds of kilometers of mines underneath that are basically, it's kind of like if you imagine this as a cross section at the French border, it's a like super porous underground environment. And one of the aspects that Franziska is now working on. Originally, we commissioned her and I don't know if you know the band Mogwai, to do a soundtrack for this particular geography. But then when Franziska visited for the first time when she came for a residency, she also realized that it's actually super interesting that there's so many spaces there that are either about to disappear or that have already disappeared, or that they will soon, let's say, fall into some kind of state of not only disrepair, but that they won't be usable anymore. So she actually started to do sound recordings in the sense of reverb recordings. So she's building plugins. I don't know if you're familiar with this this kind of technology, but it's basically, let's say, if the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra wanted to record a piece that sounds like it was played in the Sydney Opera House, you would use the plugin of the Sydney Opera House that's basically like a 3D model in terms of the reverberation. And so you then mix it through that filter, and it then sounds like it was recorded in this other space. And we're actually at the moment building up with her an archive of those spaces. So this was one of the examples, which was also for us super interesting because we spent like half a day underground, which was actually extremely kind of tedious work. And then also, for example, in other spaces such as these spaces where, or that have already been, let's say, made derelict after the steel companies moved out. I'm going to stop here with the presentation of the project because I think otherwise this would go on for too long. I just want to leave you with 12 thoughts that are connecting partially to this and partially to the kind of front section of the presentation that has to do with the questions around cross-benching. 1, alienation. Is it possible to transplant debate into situations which by default create a setting that fosters spatial and therefore social friction in order to generate productive debate? 2, decentralization. Is it possible to introduce localized micro-parliaments that foster extended neighborhood debates in order for them to be trickled up the formal political ladder as a democracy of scales? 3, resources. How would such physical setting be constituted with less economic means, but retain the same political influence? 4, orientation. Is it possible to insert essential outsiders into situations which are primarily governed by a pre-consensual status quo? 5, choreography. Is it possible to generate a physical object that by scale and location produces a contemporary datum for the essential debate, one which allows for programmatic and physical standoff between different political camps? 6, proximity. Is it possible to generate situations of presence that foster transparency while exacerbating political debate? 7, friction. Any spatial situation is driven by underlying conflicts. Those can be designed or happen spontaneously. In any case, they will always alter the narrative of the situation. 8, institution. Any hardware requires a software. How can one consider the structural and institutional components that play an integral role in terms of how a public architecture can perform? When do the opening hours become programmatic? 9, support structure. What constitutes the bare physical minimum in order to create a public situation from which to generate debate? 10, camp. How can one consider physical and non-physical forms and formats of design that together form a hybrid typology as a direct response to both spatial and organizational needs? 11, enablers. How can a specific physical scale be merged with a series of uneasy triggers in order to generate deliberate zones of conversational and performative friction. So some of them, unfortunately, because I didn't now talk about my own work, so some of them refer to my own work, so maybe they're a little bit unclear at the moment, but they're basically all these kind of spatial designs, they deal with the question of proximity and discourse. 12, pandemic. Since the beginning of the lockdowns, no one has the answers. Thank you. Okay. So,
maybe you could do it, yeah? Yes, I mean, any questions maybe?
Sure, I can begin. Yeah, I can do it without the mic, right?
Yes.
So thank you. So it was really I greatly enjoyed this, event, and the talks were really great, but also the kind of match, right? Is how your talk, Julio, set the stage for what Markus delivered, right? And I was wondering, I mean, first you started with this notion of configurations, which was very helpful, right? And you presented, the lab, the forum, the exhibition, and so on. And of course, these are the kind of new instruments of let's say, urban governance. But as you said, and you also, Markus, underlined, we are often somehow uncomfortable with these formats. I mean, first of all, you talked about, you mentioned participation washing, or you could say exhibition washing, or, we have had in the first session Ivo Čukić from Belgrade, a city where parallel institution was founded, in order to fill a gap, right, in a highly authoritarian situation where all those configurations are used, but clearly they do not have democratic legitimacy, right? So it becomes a kind of a theater of governance, right? So in a way, these formats have limits, and they can be also abused, right? And so the question is, what those limits are, and how, how the interaction can be healthy and truly participatory, right? And so what I'm interested in then, what you are in a way exploring, or somehow you're teasing out, you are probing that proximity, right, with the police, with other organs, with politicians, with parties, and so in a way I think you are hesitant to in a way define the format. The format is always fluid, right, and somehow responsive, right? And so I think that's really intelligent, and I really enjoy that, no? And so my question is somehow, I think let's say professorship gives a possibility, a kind of a framework to do that, right? But how do we produce these fluid institutions? How do we multiply them? How do we I think it's really an interesting problem, because we could just say, well, this is the great way to practice education. Let's all go into the city, right? I mean, is that realistic? So in a way, I wonder how Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm thinking. You know, to truly solve the problem of urban governance, right? We need thousands of you know, cultures of assembly, and this is in a way my question. I mean, how do we do that, right?
Okay, there's many questions in there. I would say, so I think first of all, I really enjoyed this notion that you introduced right in the beginning of the limits, because I think this is one thing that's very important to understand, that, like, for example, we would never say that would, on a kind of general level, try to, let's say, solve any of these issues, but we're trying to look at specific, let's say, topics or particular phenomena, and then try to work with them, but in a way so that ideally, at the end of this process, we'll be able to develop some kind of tools so that also people who are, because you also mentioned the, you know, in the context of a professorship, of course that's easy, but what happens if, for example, you're a member of the public, or you're an architect, you're a planner, you're someone else who wants to make some change on a kind of local scale. That's for sure not easy, and I'm also sure that we will fail on many fronts. But I think it also depends a little bit on, like, how it's being approached. So, for example, strangely, the biggest of the projects where we thought we were most likely to fail with the assembly, this one actually seems like, and this was really not going to our expectation, it's actually working, and it actually seems like they're signing it in the sense, I mean, it already starts in the fall, but they're actually gonna, it looks like they're gonna sign the fact that it's gonna go into the Constitution. But then the smaller ones, they're really problematic, because when you actually work with the communities, then it's very difficult to do all this kind of, you know, step-by-step work, you know, which is mostly, of course, about trust building. And then the question is, how can this be later adopted by other practitioners, for example? I think that's a very a valid question. And I think what's very interesting for me was also extremely helpful to see these, like, broken down into these different kind of segments and typologies. When I criticize some of them, I don't mean to say that they shouldn't exist, but I think it should always be a plus, you know, it should always be an and. I think it's very important that these things exist and that people can also go, for example, they can, you know, voice their concerns about particular projects and so on. But for me, sometimes, at least with some of these examples, they're quite passive in the sense that it necessitates a lot of, let's say, direct action from citizens, who most of them actually literally can't afford being part of this. So.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I didn't show them to criticize, neither to relativize them. It was more like an agnostic exploration or description. But I agree with both of you. You know, like this, it's some sort of theater, or you called them the usual suspects. I was part of a research project where we called them Berufsbürger, like they have contracts, they are showing up when it's always this usual suspects. And also, I mean, what I liked about your comment, Milica, it's I think, we need more horizontal spaces, because often it's like, you know, the top down is countered by bottom up or by activism. And I think what you showed interestingly is like, slowing down the process, you know, like making provocations, rethinking the different modes of being more proximate last week we had Rebecca Wall here, and they had the Zauderbude, they created a space of encounter where actually all those stakeholders needed to rethink, what does participation actually mean? So starting with because you also mentioned it, there's so much, you can project so many things onto these formats that I think one thing I really want to show is also that, like local governments have adopted all this vocabulary already, and so we need, like, I guess the role of educators, but also of spatial practitioners, is like to tease out where we can intervene, where it can make more sense. And yeah, your chair shows it, but yeah, there's a lot of work, I guess, to distribute the agency, I guess.
I mean, maybe one other quick remark to this question of horizontality and also distributed or decentralized both knowledge and some form of action, let's say. The reason why I wanted to show this example of the Diwania in Kuwait is that what's extremely smart about this system, you could call it, is that it's literally spread all over the city, but it doesn't ask you to do anything. It's just there. So like when somebody goes there to hang out, they don't go there with this kind of mindset, oh, now I'm going to participate, but they just go and see their friends and they hang out. I mean, I guess it's a kind of similar, I don't know, it would be like going to the pub somewhere else. But basically, they establish a routine where in a very kind of informal context, they also talk about all these subjects because these spaces are extremely local, so they also talk about those local topics. And then there's a smart system to somehow like pick them up in terms of, what concerns them and bring those concerns to the next level. And I think that's for sure, I would say in most Central European geographies, something that's completely missing. And I think also now with the rise of the far-right movements, you can totally tell that this is going really the wrong way.
I fully agree. I think that Diwania is really an interesting example, and I think that it's probably traceable across the entire Ottoman world, right? Because where I come from, let's say former Yugoslavia, that was also part of Serbia was part of the Ottoman Empire, so we are familiar with the divan, right? So that literally means, gathering in a private space or public space, and so that form is traceable, I think, across many different countries. But when you speak about formats that are embedded in a kind of architecture of governance, right? So I can think back of another example, which is a socialist self-management in a former Yugoslavia, right? That had extremely high interest and commitment toward decentralization of governance, right? So the idea of self-management meant, inhabitants should manage their houses, workers should manage the factories, students and professors manage universities, and so literally taking the responsibility, for kind of, financial and all other decisions, right? And so let's say the small institution of the house council means that all inhabitants of a building have a legal responsibility to gather, for instance, I don't remember anymore how often it was, but let's say once a month or so, people literally were gathering, for instance, on a evening in a week and, making some decisions. Are we going to, repair the elevator or, paint the walls, or what happens with the playground and so on, right? And this is of course the kind of hard work of this participatory democracy. You have to be there. You have to put the time, and I do agree when you ask the question, who participates and how. I mean, we have to. This is a very concrete question. It's a question of a kind of practice of time, of engagement in a very concrete ways, and I do agree, I think that looking at your presentation, it really illuminates in my mind this I believe it's a fact that we lack a kind of more granular forms of governance that are smaller scale, right, than what we normally have, I would say, currently in Europe. I mean, if we use this notion of a European city as you used, Julio. And for instance, in Belgrade, because it's an example that I'm familiar with, I mean, for 6 months there are protests that are completely, ground up, and, people are looking for a way of returning to kind of forms of direct democracy, right? And then finding that these structures, obviously, have been erased, those that have been put in place, for instance, through socialist kind of self-management. I mean, there were, local community spaces, etc. All of that was prioritized. All of that has been removed, and there is I think the spatial question is a question that is real, and that is a question of a kind of certain commitment to to local governance, right? And perhaps we can discuss, or I'm wondering through your example, right? I mean, is there a scale that makes sense, right? Is there, how are communities formed in a contemporary city today? What is the kind of are we talking about the kind of very, very kind of polymorphous networks that should negotiate their own forms of interaction, or can we talk about some kind of proximities that are that are.
I think it starts. I think to answer this question, you need to look at the specific city or the specific context that you're referring to. So, for example, 3 years ago, I moved with my family from Berlin to a small city between Frankfurt and Heidelberg that's more or less the same population size as Esch. In Berlin, I would say my community, whatever that means, was connected mostly to, let's say, content-related questions. So kind of like a bubble that was not necessarily geographical. So it could be, I mean, it was all over the city, people, and of course also you could say globally, but when you talk about the city, I would say it was quite dispersed and decentralized. Now, and also when I look, for example, at the example of Esch, I would say it's much more localized in the sense that you also feel like you belong to a particular site, where you also have a much more closer relationship with the people who are essentially neighbors. And I think the reason for this is that literally because it's so small that there's still this possibility to, in a way, kind of like choose where you want to belong. I mean, it's maybe a little bit kind of glorifying because that's of course not true for everyone. But it's very interesting if you look at Esch and the way in which, for example, let's say the migrant communities spatialize. It's basically like kind of spatial clusters. And it's also interesting because it produces a very particular kind of, both belonging, but also a kind of like geographical area in which a different reality can be produced. So when I was saying this before about these different streets, where it's amazing. You literally feel like you're walking into a different geography. It's because of language, because of the way in which the shops operate, the way in which the language, the written, the typographic language, both aesthetically and of course in terms of the actual language that's being used, is being played out. And I think there, for example, this model of proximity already works quite well, because people still talk to one another. I mean, they talk mostly to one another within that particular community and maybe not so much outside, which is also, of course, a language issue often. But I would say in bigger cities, this is very difficult.
Maybe, thank you very much for your presentation. I think when we are talking about scale and democracy and participation, I think we always have to be precise, because a democratic system is always about majority and representation. And participation is not about representation. It's always, I think, it's mostly about making things better, because things, projects or whatever, make it better because you involve more voices that have another way of viewing things, because they have a different background. And we are not only talking about experts and politicians and maybe also people from administration. And therefore, I think the scale, you always have to think about the scale concerning the question that you want to discuss in a process of participation. And I think, yes, mostly it's much easier to work in a smaller scale, of course, because the people bring their knowledge from their local knowledge in something, which is very helpful. And when you, for example, when you showed the project about democracy, how we want to live democracy, and to discuss about a system, a political system, then it gets more and more complicated. And then I think you have to think about the scale in an absolutely different way. And I thought it was very interesting, because then you showed much more a process with concrete stakeholders, because you want to involve them, because at the end they have to change things. So it's always a question,
Right.
What is the aim? Do you want to involve stakeholders so that they change afterwards, bring things into action? Mm-hmm. Is it about bringing things into action? Mm-hmm. Or is it more about learning, which is different? So it's always very important when we are talking about participation to be very, very precise in your question, but also in the way how you organize the process. Because otherwise it fails. It was clear what you were talking about. Normally it fails because it's not precise enough. And it's open where it shouldn't be open, and it's closed where it shouldn't be closed. Yeah, that's often, it's very difficult to do that, but it's very important to think about that. And that's the reason why we have to practice, to learn and learn and learn.
I think maybe just to quickly connect to your early point about majorities.
Yes.
I think one thing that's interesting, for example, about this douanier approach is that on the one hand you have this kind of decentralized network of proximity, which is very local and which is very small scale. But on the other hand, of course, you can also use it as a form of, let's say, I mean, that takes time, of course, but also organizing majorities, even if it's very on a very small scale.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it could be a way how you organize a big process to involve very special stakeholders and also people that are not so easily to be involved, because this is also one of the big questions. How can we involve people that are not used to be involved or have a different language or whatever, what else. So, but a very nice idea with this, also with a symbolic, I like it when you are talking about really the quality of the space, of the physical space that you create to involve different stakeholders. Very nice. I like it very much.
I wanted to actually continue this thought because, and also to what Milica previously said, I also enjoy the whole CU cultures of assembly, and also not just the formats, but really the rethinking the tools and the modes of reassembling the initiatives, but also the approaches. What I was thinking is that you are also an actor, no, in these networks, and you also have a certain legitimacy, probably because of being either an architect or a scholar. How do you reflect on your own role in this constellation? Because I mean, like, probably I know what is interesting is like you try to give voice to others and bring actually like maybe minorities or other communities in. So do you see yourself only as a facilitator or also an idea generator or both, or
yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, for sure both, but maybe also some other, maybe to bring in the plus again.
Yeah.
So there's maybe some more roles, and also I think the roles, they depend on the context in which you're operating, and also what's the specificity of that particular, let's say, either, for example, with the Esch Clinics, the section of the project which one is dealing with at that moment in time. But also generally, I would say I often also try to stay in the background and use it more as a way to produce a ground on which things can happen.
Yeah.
So I guess there's a certain curatorial aspect also, but I think curatorial can be misleading because then it's again about representation also, or presentation, and I think often it's actually about the processes that start to enable others to work on those topics or also work together. I mean, often it's the case even that you have to connect people that have not been, talking to each other before. Or that feel, for example, that would not be able, for example, to address the formal political structure themselves, or not necessarily as an individual, but also sometimes as a group or collective, but that would feel either because of their own backgrounds or because of maybe not feeling empowered enough to do this.
And is there a risk to be, let's say, co-opted? Like the city of Esch says, like we are being more democratic now. I mean, because of...
For sure.
Okay.
I mean, this is a huge thing, and this is one thing that we discuss like every week at the chair. Because there's also sometimes moments where you think, okay, it's strange. Like the example with DemocracyNext. I mean, when we met like the first time in Paris, maybe 2.5 years ago. And then we discussed, and so this was at a moment when Claudia Schwalitz, the director, she had just founded it, and it was at this moment where they were looking for partners. And I said, okay, this would be fantastic to work on this together, but I'm very doubtful that the city would ever agree on this. I mean, they would probably say, okay, we're interested, but they wouldn't really like go all the way, And even more so because the city has a conservative government, and I thought that exactly so when all of a sudden, okay, there was then a new mayor, but also conservative party, but much more, let's say, open. And then we started like many conversations, and he at some point said, okay, that they would be interested. then already like all the alarm bells were ringing, because of course then you also understand, I mean, they would never say yes to this if they don't see their own, like what's their asset, you know? And that's, for example, why it was also for us super important that the main thing would be that this becomes really not a project, but it becomes an infrastructure that's embedded into the city, and especially into the city services, because they're also, that's the interesting thing. I mean, when we work with the city, we usually work with the services. So these are people who've been there, you know, some of them for like 25 years, especially, for example, in the social services. They have very strong connections through different, you know, people, communities, groups in the city. And they also, they know how to survive like political decisions. So they know how to, for example, implement certain things that would, you know, also last, you know, throughout an election period, for example. But nevertheless, that all sounds nice, but of course it's a real topic, and it's really difficult because, of course, every day, I mean, everyone, and that's not only true for, let's say, the political class, or in this case, in our case, the Chefenrat. They all have, of course, specific ideas. Also then, you know, when we had these meetings with the different parties, so it could be that you talk to the opposition, but then the opposition is like 4 parties, and then even in the so the opposition disagrees, but then also each party within the opposition disagrees. So, but I think the most difficult thing will be to organize ways in the long run that you can somehow make sure that you kind of plant a seed that can somehow survive these kind of, you know, smaller changes on the kind of, let's say, the ripple effects. If you think of it as an ocean, I think politics is kind of like the top strata, and then everything else happening underneath, partially with the services and so on. And on the top, of course, there's a lot of movement, but actually a little bit below already the sea is quite stable. So.
Interesting. I mean, I think that maybe this metaphor, I mean, you know, let's say that let's look at the political landscape in Europe, but let's just look like a bit beyond, let's say, Western Europe, or this kind of core zone, right? Of you know, let's look, you know, toward, you know, Romania, Ukraine, you know, Western Balkan, and so on. And we see a lot of instability. We see, let's go to Hungary, right? We see a lot of instability. I mean, there is a very interesting, you know, what you spoke about, Regula, this democracy being a system of majority representation, right? But this system requires trust, you know, in institutions that are produced. But we have now, in that broader picture of Europe, I would say, if we now drew with colors, where we have that basic trust in institutions and we don't have them, we have a very, very large geography where this basic condition is not fulfilled, right? And then we have this kind of, you know, a ground up participatory institutions working to improve conditions, you know, for themselves and kind of immediate or proximate networks. And then we have this complete disconnection from some kind of a institutional level which has legitimacy only with a certain, you know, segment of the let's say of the voting population. And very often the government is actually illegitimate, right? And I think then the role of these small assemblies becomes almost you know, reparative you know, these become a kind of vital assemblies that really have to do with the kind of survival of civil society, survival of freedoms, of rights, and so on. And that's why I think that also this kind of let's say, infrastructure or the possibility, right, that to embed the possibility of this local level of governance, of this micro-governance is so essential. And, you know, there is a phenomenon in urban studies, right, that is, it's a process that is traceable, sometimes called peripheralization, right? So that means withdrawal of state, you know, from, let's say, organs of local governance. And if we go to rural areas, we've had wonderful studies here at ETH, where, for instance, the country of Greece decided that you know, the local municipalities in rural Greece will disappear, and you know what used to be, let's say, 100 local municipalities where each one, you know, had a doctor and a post office and a school and received, you know, basically funds to run these institutions locally. You know, suddenly this is all defunded, and now we have one administration in the center of that region, right? So in a way, that I mean, the question, you know, what is at the local level, what is part of the formal, to say so, pyramid of governance in the sense of formalized, in the sense that there is it's legal, legitimate, there is access to funding, you know, there is a, you know, spatial frame, there is, you know, so, I mean, these questions are recurrent. I mean, of course, for instance, in Switzerland, the big debate was, you know, should Switzerland fund, you know, the kind of maintenance of these kind of social infrastructures in the Alps when there has been, you know, basically the loss of population, right? So these are political questions, but we are talking about, for instance, in the, I mentioned city of Belgrade, I mean this peripheralization, this erasure of the structure of local governance was, I believe, you know, it's not because, you know, people have left. No, the city is growing, right? I mean, so there is a kind of politically, I think it's simply a way of concentrating power in a certain way, right? So it's a way of you know, let's say reorganizing, to say so, the field of urban politics, right? So I think this kind of understanding, or I think that you know, perhaps in Switzerland we are in a very a beautiful example of a kind of very stable, you know, trustworthy institutions where we don't have these problems. But I think in a lot of situations we really look at a kind of problematic sphere, you know, in terms of scales and in terms of this existence of political resources that people can, you know, use, basically.
I think it's a really fantastic example of, you know, what's happening when you take away small-scale infrastructure, like you mentioned, for example, from like smaller villages in the Alps, for example. Like you start to remove this, and it's like draining the blood. And I mean, socially speaking. And to give you an example from Esch, there was recently a decision being made that we then started a debate with the mayor about this, that they said that they were going, because of course, like what's interesting for politicians is projects. So they decide they're going to have like 2, 3, 4 major things, and then, you know, they make sure that those projects work. So one big project was, for example, that for the whole of the south of the country, they're building a new hospital, like a big hospital, which of course means that some smaller hospitals will close. That's already bad enough, but now they made one decision that they also want to put next to it a Ärztehaus. So basically one building for all the small doctors from Esch to be centralized in one space. I mean, that's like, if they do this, it's going to be like an implosion of the city center, and all the old people, which there's a lot actually, they will suffer from this so much, because this is really like these kind of, the doctor, the bakery, you have like a couple of things that are really important as this kind of social glue, and the moment you take them out, and it's not even about saying, okay, let's say we used to have 40 doctors, so now let's only have 20. No, that's not the case. We still have 40, but we'll centralize them. But they don't understand that the fact that they just put them somewhere else will create completely different reality. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, of course, this is a question of funds, and this is a question of somehow understanding what is the right proportion. This is because in a way, space always requires from us to think in that way. I mean, of course, you were talking about these new configurations being something different than the kind of old style master planning, right? But the normative model was saying, okay, the social unit was, I don't know how many, let's say 15,000 people had to have one. That's the municipality, right? And that has one hairdresser and a shoemaker, etc., right? And with what kind of, are there any parameters that we can reasonably rely on, right? If we discuss the kind of phenomena of contemporary city, right? I'm curious. We have abandoned any kind of hope of a kind of normative thinking, right? But I think it's nevertheless. If we discuss all these examples that we are discussing, we can see clearly that we have to talk across the differences, right? We have to find a way to speak, between the Alps and the, I don't know, the city of Esch and so on. Yeah.
Let's talk again in 2.5 years, and then you tell me whether it worked or not.